So I'm going to go ahead and leave this watercolor layer as it is, but I'm going to turn off the visibility of this. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and look at another category that does the same thing that watercolors do by creating its own layer, and that is the liquid ink category. Now, these liquid ink tools that I've created here are all based around the concept of high contrast black and white artwork, and as such, they cannot apply any color. Now, if you look at some of the default brushes here in the Painter Brushes brush library, under the liquid ink category, you'll find many that can apply color. However, mine are set up not to apply color, and again, the reason for that is because I want a high contrast black and white look. So if I come over here and do something like the inking sable, immediately you're going to notice my color turns to black because again, we're only working with black and white effects here. And I can begin to paint, but if you notice, I'm still on the watercolor layer and it's still telling me that we can only use watercolor brushes on watercolor layers. So if I want to have a liquid ink layer, I can do one of two things. I can either click on the canvas, which meaning a non-watercolor layer, and I can begin to draw, and that will pop up a liquid ink layer, or I can come back down here, hold down, and you notice I have an option here for a new liquid ink layer. Now I'll just go ahead and show you how it automatically happens by making that first mark. So now we have a liquid ink layer. And again, if we were to try to paint watercolor on the liquid ink layer, it would create a new watercolor layer. So it's important to note that these two layers are not compatible at all. Now I'm just going to go ahead and just begin making some marks here and building up some texture with this. So I'm going to use some of the other brushes like the Hunt 102 Crow Quill. I'm going to use the Explosive, and hopefully you can begin to see some of the effects that this can achieve. This is a really wonderful category of brushes. Now, why would we use these liquid ink brushes versus, say, something like the old-fashioned pen scratchboard tools and that kind of stuff that have been previously used in Painter? Well, the reason why is because the way that the liquid ink category works is that it's building up density and it's recording a certain amount of density, and then it's using that information to allow us to create different effects via the density. So if I use something like, say, the splatter negative, what's happening is it's not just putting down white paint, and that might be what you think is what's happening, but it's actually deleting density. And so you can see that there's actually bits here where it's not pure black or white, it's actually kind of gray. And the reason why is because it didn't completely get rid of the density. And likewise, if we come back with something like, say, the rough dry brush, and we paint over that, you can see that it's reacting to the density of what was laid down, and it's going to give us a different effect whether or not there was any kind of that white of the negative splatter. Now, what that is effectively doing is it's resisting putting down new paint, meaning that out here it's going to give us a nice smooth kind of roughness, whereas in here it's going to give us a very blotchy roughness. And again, the reason why is because that resist is causing a variation in the density of what's being laid down. If I come back over here and I do something like the razor scratch, it's effectively removing density. And you can see that it's removing different parts at a different rate depending upon how dense the paint was put down. So this can give us some very nice, very natural effects that are much more painterly and much more natural than any kind of traditional scratchboard tool or whatever that people have previously used for this type of work. So I highly recommend that you play with my liquid ink category here and see all the various different effects that you can have. Now, as I said before, if we come in here and we begin to work with this, we're building up density. So I've got some density and I've got some interesting texture. If we double click on this liquid ink layer, and again, you'll know it's a liquid ink layer because you can see this little black icon. See how the watercolor has a blue icon? Well, the liquid ink has a black icon. And if we have just a brand new layer of a regular type, you'll see that it has no color associated at all. It's just sort of this whitish color. But if I go back to my liquid ink layer and I double click on that layer and open up the liquid ink layer attributes, you'll see that we have at the bottom threshold and amount. Now, currently the threshold is set at 0%. What a threshold is basically doing is it's going to control how that density reveals itself. So if we increase the threshold and we hit OK, you'll see that less and less of that is visible. It's basically being pushed back, so to speak, the visibility of that density. If I come back over here and I reduce the threshold to below 0 and I hit OK, you're going to see that more and more of that black is revealed, and that is just basically making the density more visible. Now, I know this is kind of strange sounding, but the idea basically being is that this is sort of an exposure value Not all that different from exposing, overexposing, or underexposing a photograph. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this back down to 0. And I want to show you the amount slider. The amount slider is basically allowing us to control an impasto effect that's unique to the liquid ink layer. So if I go ahead and increase that amount to something like, say, 485 and hit OK, you'll see that we now have sort of this impasto effect that's very unique to the liquid ink layer. And if I go ahead and continue painting with this, like so, you can see I'm cutting away that impasto, or I'm going to go ahead and add to that impasto by putting down extra splatters. And it just gives the liquid ink layer that much more interesting of effect. So, here this is giving us more of a sandy look. Whereas if we turn off that amount, which is basically the amount of the impasto effect, we're getting that flat graphic look. So if you want more of an impasto effect, then increase the amount and you'll get that impasto effect. If you want to have more of a graphic effect, then just turn that off completely and you'll end up with a nice flat graphic black and white artwork effect. So those are the liquid ink tools, and like I say, if you go and you play with the Painter 12 default liquid ink category, you'll see that there's even more effects that are available, but I custom created mine, all these brushes here in my liquid ink, as line art creation tools for basically comic books and cartooning techniques.